A child spends the first 10 years of her life in a box. No sunlight, no human voice, fed blindfolded in complete silence. When authorities finally find her at 11 years old, they call her the feral girl. She communicates only through animal grunts. The woman beside her, presumably her mother, is dead. 20 years later, wealthy industrialists across post-war Europe begin spending fortunes for no reason anyone can identify. They liquidate assets, burn cash, and then they vanish. When their bodies surface, they're found in pieces, transformed into religious statuary, missing limbs and tongues and eyes. The few survivors who remain speak of a woman with hypnotic charisma who asked them to cut away their sins. They describe her with the reverence usually reserved for saints. Her name is Liliya, and by the time Murkoff Corporation identifies her as a potential prime asset, she's already left a trail of mutilated believers across 3 countries, survived years during the siege of Leningrad as an ambush predator hiding among frozen corpses, and spent 5 years at Mount Massive Asylum sedated to the point of catatonia, because even Murkoff's most experienced psychiatrists couldn't find another way to stop her from converting their staff into self-mutilating acolytes. This is the story of someone who either speaks with the voice of God or has perfected the most dangerous form of manipulation human psychology has ever produced. Over the next several hours, we're going to trace her complete arc from that homemade prison in 1939 to the pharmacy station at Sinyala, where she observes reagents with the patience of the praying mantis whose name she adopted. By the end, you'll understand how childhood trauma can forge someone who weaponizes faith, how institutions repeatedly fail to contain certain kinds of damage, and why Liliya represents the most ambiguous prime asset Murkoff ever recruited. Someone whose danger comes not from sadism or emptiness, but from absolute conviction that God is speaking through her. If you enjoy this type of content, please drop a comment letting me know what part related for you, whether it was a specific detail, a connection you made, or just a moment that stuck with you. You can also throw out a topic suggestion for a future video. I'm always looking for the next game rabbit hole to fall into, and some of the best video ideas have come from you guys. Okay, now get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's start. Chapter 1. The Homemade Prison. In 1939, authorities in an unspecified location discovered something that would defy their ability to process or explain. A young girl, approximately 11 years old, living inside a homemade prison cell. The structure was crude but effective, built to contain a human being for extended periods, to prevent escape, to ensure total isolation from the outside world. Beside the cell, they found a dead woman. The condition of the body suggested she'd been deceased for some time. Authorities presumed this woman was the girl's mother, though verification proved impossible. The girl couldn't provide confirmation. She couldn't speak. The only sounds she produced were animal-like grunts, vocalizations that resembled no human language the authorities had encountered. The news coverage of this discovery referred to her as the feral girl. The terminology wasn't metaphorical. This child had been so thoroughly isolated from human contact that the basic developmental processes most children undergo naturally, learning language, recognizing faces, understanding social interaction, had never occurred. She functioned more like a wild animal that happened to be shaped like a human than like a child who'd been abused. The Sisters of St. Gaspar's orphanage agreed to take responsibility for her care. The facility was located in Paris, close enough to Notre Dame that the bells would become a constant presence in her new life. The sisters understood they were accepting an extraordinary challenge. This wasn't a child who needed education or discipline. This was someone who needed to learn how to be human from absolute foundational basics. Authorities launched investigations to find surviving family members or anyone who might be responsible for her condition. The homemade prison suggested intentional confinement rather than neglect or accident. Someone had built that structure. Someone had kept this child locked inside it for years. The dead woman being her mother was the working theory, but questions remained about whether others had been involved, whether there were surviving relatives who might claim her, whether criminal charges could be brought against anyone for what had been done. The investigation eventually pieced together fragments of her background. Her parents had been Russian landowners, part of the class that faced persecution during the revolution. They'd fled their homeland, becoming exiles trying to survive in a world that had destroyed everything they'd known. The specifics of how they ended up where they did, why the mother created this prison, what circumstances led to this level of isolation, these details remained unclear, buried in the chaos of displacement and the mother's death. What became clear through later accounts was the nature of that isolation. Liliya, the name she would eventually adopt, though authorities had no name for her initially, had spent approximately the first 10 years of her life inside that box, a homemade prison that prevented her from seeing sunlight, from seeing her mother's face, from hearing her mother's voice, except perhaps through the walls that separated them. She was breastfed, blindfolded. The mother would enter the cell, feed the child without speaking, without showing her face, maintaining absolute sensory deprivation except for the sustenance necessary for physical survival. No words were spoken during these feedings. No comfort was provided beyond the biological minimum. The child existed in near total darkness and silence, her world consisting of the dimensions of her prison and nothing else. The psychological damage this inflicted is difficult to overstate. Human development requires social interaction. Infants who don't receive adequate human contact during critical developmental windows experience profound impairments that can never be fully corrected. Language acquisition has specific time frames. Children who don't hear language before certain ages struggle to develop linguistic ability even with intensive later intervention. Facial recognition, emotional understanding, the capacity to form attachments, all of these require exposure and interaction during early childhood. Liliya had received none of this. The first human face she ever saw belonged to the police, who discovered her at 11 years old. The first human voice she heard belonged to those same officers. Everything that most children absorb gradually through constant exposure to caregivers, siblings, and community, she encountered for the first time at an age when these developmental windows had largely closed. The Sisters of St. Gaspar's Orphanage faced a challenge unprecedented in their experience. Liliya didn't adapt well to her new environment. This was documented in reports describing how she regularly disrupted the orphanage's operations. Authorities noted that her behavior could point toward a history of abuse, though the homemade prison itself already provided overwhelming evidence. She was emaciated when she arrived. Years of minimal nutrition and no physical activity had left her body underdeveloped. She moved strangely, her physical coordination impaired by never having space to explore movement. Her social behaviors were so outside normal parameters that the other girls at the orphanage initially avoided her entirely, recognizing something fundamentally wrong even if they couldn't articulate what. One behavior stood out as particularly disturbing to the sisters. Liliya acted as though she'd never eaten solid food before. When presented with meals, she struggled to understand how to consume them. Instead, she attempted to be breastfed by one of the nuns, not in the manner of a young child seeking comfort, but with the desperation of someone for whom this was the only form of eating she understood. The sisters, while dedicated to caring for troubled children, found this behavior impossible to accommodate. Their rejection of her attempts created additional trauma layered onto the foundation of abandonment and isolation Liliya already carried. She was being refused the only form of nurturing she knew, in a place that was supposed to provide care. by people who represented the closest thing to mother figures available in her new world. The other girls at the orphanage shunned her during this period. Children can be cruel to peers who seem different, and Liliya was different in ways that triggered instinctive discomfort. She moved wrong, she sounded wrong, she seemed more animal than human. The social hierarchies that form in any group of children excluded her entirely, leaving her isolated even in a building full of people. This isolation within community might have been worse than the physical isolation of her prison. At least in the box, she had no awareness of what she was missing. At the orphanage, she could see other girls forming friendships, engaging in social interactions she couldn't understand or participate in, existing in a world she'd been excluded from through no fault of her own. But something shifted. The exact timeline isn't documented precisely, but at some point during her teenage years at the orphanage, Liliya began to change. She became obsessed with the Bible. The religious texts that formed the foundation of the orphanage's educational curriculum captured her attention in ways nothing else had. She learned to speak. The process was rapid. Once it began, suggesting that whatever cognitive impairments might have resulted from her early deprivation hadn't destroyed her capacity for language acquisition. She claimed that God himself was talking to her, that the voice of the divine was teaching her how to communicate, how to understand the world, how to function in ways she'd been unable to before. Language development that should have taken years happened in months. Social skills that had been entirely absent began emerging, and something else appeared: charisma. The other girls who had previously shunned her began warming to her presence. They found her overwhelmingly magnetic once she could speak. Whatever had made her disturbing when she was mute transformed into something compelling when she gained the ability to communicate. She told them that God spoke to her, and they believed her. She described visions and missions, and they listened with fascination rather than dismissal. God had told her who she was, the Russian Joan of Arc. This wasn't metaphor or aspiration. She understood this as literal truth. Just as Joan of Arc had heard divine voices commanding her to save France, Liliya heard God telling her that she was destined to save Russia. Her sacred mission was clear: walk to St. Petersburg and liberate it from the Hun. The terminology is significant. During World War II, which was approaching as Liliya reached her mid to late teens, the Germans were sometimes referred to as Huns in propaganda and common speech. Liliya's mission wasn't a vague spiritual calling. It was a specific military and nationalist objective. Return to the homeland her parents had fled, the nation she'd never seen, and fight the invaders who threatened it. The orphanage couldn't prevent her from leaving. She wasn't imprisoned there, just housed. When she decided her mission required departing, she simply left. No dramatic escape was necessary. She walked out of the Parisian Catholic orphanage, leaving behind the bells of Notre Dame and the only structured environment she'd known since being discovered in that homemade cell, and began traveling on foot towards St. Petersburg. The journey itself isn't well documented. A teenage girl traveling alone from Paris toward Russia during the late 1930s would have faced extraordinary dangers and obstacles. The political situation in Europe was deteriorating rapidly. Borders were hardening. Resources were scarce. A lone traveler without money or connections should have faced insurmountable barriers. But Liliya made it. Somehow, through means that aren't clearly recorded, she reached Russian territory, and what happened next would transform her from an orphan girl with delusions of divine mission into a legend that German soldiers would tell in whispered fear, and Russian forces would celebrate as proof that God fought alongside them. Chapter 2: The Siege of Leningrad and the Birth of a Legend. World War II began in September 1939. By June 22, 1941, Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union with overwhelming force. The Wehrmacht advanced rapidly, destroying Soviet defensive positions and pushing deep into Russian territory. By September 1941, German forces had surrounded Leningrad, beginning what would become one of the longest and most brutal sieges in military history. The siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days. During that period, approximately 1 million Soviet civilians died, mostly from starvation, though cold, disease, and German bombardment claimed hundreds of thousands more. The city became a frozen hell where survival required resources and resilience that exceeded what most human beings could sustain. Somewhere in this nightmare, stories began circulating about someone called the Angel of Leningrad. Soviet soldiers reported encounters with a figure who appeared in the midst of battle, who fought the Germans with tactics that seemed almost supernatural, who vanished into shadows and rubble like a ghost. The Germans heard these stories too, though their accounts painted the figure as a demon rather than an angel, something to be feared rather than celebrated. This figure was Liliya. She'd made it to Leningrad before or during the siege's early stages, and she'd taken her divine mission literally. God had sent her to fight the Germans. The siege provided exactly the war she believed she'd been called to wage. She adopted the name Bogomolova, a designation that God had told her to use. According to her own accounts, the name carries layered meaning in Russian. It translates most directly as beloved of God, marking her as someone chosen for divine purposes. But Bogomol is also the Russian term for a praying mantis, the ambush predator known for remaining perfectly still while camouflaged, waiting for prey to come within striking distance before attacking with devastating speed. Both meanings applied to how Liliya functioned during the siege. She fought as an ambush predator, using tactics that prioritized patience and camouflage over direct confrontation. The frozen landscape of Leningrad provided perfect conditions for her approach. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried or removed. The dead lay in streets and rubble, frozen solid by temperatures that regularly dropped to 20 or 30 degrees below zero. Liliya hid among these corpses. She would position herself in areas where German soldiers patrolled or advanced, lying among the frozen dead with the stillness of someone who'd spent her first 10 years learning to exist without movement or sound. When Germans passed close enough, she would strike, usually with a knife, attacking from concealment before disappearing back into the urban wasteland before they could organize a response. She also hid among statues. Leningrad's public spaces featured monuments and architectural decoration that provided cover for someone willing to remain motionless for extended periods. Liliya would position herself near or among these statues, her body adopting poses that made her difficult to distinguish from stone at a distance. Soldiers who noticed her too late would be dead before they understood their mistake. The psychological impact of these tactics was significant. German forces operating in Leningrad had to contend with constant uncertainty about whether they were truly alone or whether the Angel of Leningrad was watching from some nearby position. The frozen corpses that filled the landscape transformed from mere tragic backdrop into potential concealment for an enemy who might kill you before you even registered her presence. Soviet forces celebrated her. The stories called her Bogomolova, using the name God had given her. She was described as proof that the divine stood with Russia against the fascist invaders, that their suffering served a holy purpose, that victory was inevitable because God himself had sent a champion to fight alongside them. The legend grew with each retelling. She killed countless Germans, survived impossible situations, appeared and vanished like an angel dispensing divine judgment. The Germans were terrified of her, but they were also fascinated. The idea that a single individual, reportedly a woman, which added to the psychological disruption, could kill trained Wehrmacht soldiers through tactics that seemed almost supernatural, created a fixation among officers trying to understand and counter the threat. They wanted to capture her, to prove she was mortal rather than divine. to eliminate the psychological weapon she'd become for Soviet morale. Some German accounts from the siege mention hearing about her from Russian prisoners or from soldiers who claimed to have encountered her. The descriptions emphasized her ability to remain undetected, her preference for close quarters killing with knives, and the fanaticism that made her willing to take risks that would have killed anyone less skilled or less fortunate. Liliya survived years of this warfare during the siege. 3 years of living in a frozen city under siege, where temperatures killed as reliably as bullets, and where starvation reduced the civilian population by hundreds of thousands. She survived 3 years of hiding among corpses, of ambushing German soldiers, of existing in conditions that broke trained military personnel within months. She believed God protected her. From her perspective, her survival wasn't luck or skill. It was divine providence. God had sent her to fight, and as long as she fulfilled that mission, she would remain safe. The evidence supported her belief. She survived when millions didn't. She killed while remaining unkilled. Her tactics worked despite their inherent danger. The other survivors of the siege used different strategies. Some survived through access to resources, positions in supply chains, connections that provided extra food, roles that kept them slightly warmer or more fed than the masses. Others survived through luck, happening to avoid the bombs and the starvation long enough to reach the siege's end. Germany began retreating from Stalingrad in early 1943. The Wehrmacht's advance into the Soviet Union had stalled and then reversed. Soviet forces were pushing back, reclaiming territory, destroying German units that had seemed invincible years earlier. The tide had turned, and German officers recognized that survival now required retreat rather than continued offensive operations. During this chaotic withdrawal, a Nazi officer encountered Liliya. The circumstances aren't fully documented, but what's known is that he managed to capture her, a feat that multiple German units had attempted and failed to achieve during the siege. Perhaps she was wounded, perhaps circumstances temporarily prevented her usual tactics, perhaps simple numbers and coordination finally overcame her ability to vanish into shadows. He tried to restrain her. While doing so, she slashed his face with whatever blade she'd managed to keep despite capture. The wound was significant enough that it would scar, marking him permanently as someone who'd encountered the Angel of Leningrad and survived. Barely. His response was immediate and brutal. He chopped off her right hand as punishment for cutting him, the hand that had held the knife, the hand that had killed so many of his fellow soldiers, removed as both vengeance and practical measure to prevent her from wielding weapons again. She cursed him. The specifics of what she said aren't recorded, but the officer's reaction suggests it went beyond simple profanity. Her curse carried weight that disturbed him enough to escalate further. He cut out her tongue, the organ that allowed her to speak God's words, that had learned language under divine guidance, that could inspire believers and curse enemies. Removed, leaving her unable to speak, reducing her to the animal-like state she'd inhabited before the orphanage. What happened to Liliya during the period that followed remains unclear and deeply disturbing. German forces retreating from the Eastern Front used escape routes called the Rat Line, networks that moved people and resources through areas controlled by the Allies, usually toward the Mediterranean. These weren't comfortable evacuations. They were desperate flights by individuals who knew capture meant execution or imprisonment. Liliya was taken along this route despite her injuries, a woman without a hand and without a tongue, held by men who had every reason to hate her for the soldiers she'd killed, transported through hostile territory where no accountability structures existed to prevent them from doing whatever they wanted. The documents state carefully that there's no telling what happened to Liliya during this transport. The phrasing suggests that whatever occurred was too terrible to specify, or that evidence exists, but revealing it would require describing atrocities that serve no purpose beyond documenting suffering. Agent George Nichols, who would later investigate her, implied torture and likely sexual assault occurred during this period. The rat line terminated in Genoa, on the Italian coast. From there, refugees and escapees could catch boats to Argentina or other destinations far from the European war. Liliya arrived in Genoa without a hand, without a tongue, presumably carrying trauma from whatever had been inflicted during the journey. She was scheduled to be put on a boat to Argentina the following day. Instead, that night, she prayed. Despite everything that had been taken from her, despite the mutilations and abuse, she maintained her faith that God heard her and would respond to her need. And according to the accounts that survive, accounts that Murkoff's investigators treated as factual despite their supernatural claims, a miracle occurred. The night before she was to be shipped to Argentina, Liliya's tongue grew back. The assertion isn't presented as metaphor. The records state plainly that she regained her ability to speak, that the physical organ that had been cut out was somehow restored. Whether this actually happened through divine intervention, whether the mutilation had been less complete than initially appeared, or whether something else explains the claim, the result was the same. Liliya could speak again. But she could do more than speak. She claimed that after listening to God's voice during her prayer, she could now speak in God's own tongue. This wasn't Russian or any human language, it was something else, a form of communication that transcended normal linguistic categories, that carried power beyond what words typically convey. She used this new language on the German officers who'd been guarding her. The specifics of what she said aren't recorded, but the effect was immediate. The men who'd held her captive began fighting each other. Guards who'd presumably worked together throughout the retreat suddenly turned on one another with violent intent, attacking with the same brutality they might have directed at enemies. While they fought, Liliya walked away. Nobody tried to stop her. Nobody even seemed to notice her departure. She left Genoa and headed into the forests of Eastern Europe, vanishing from any organized tracking or documentation. She was lost for years. The exact duration isn't specified, but references to this period describe it as extended time during which her location and activities remained unknown to authorities or organized forces. The comparison was made to Jesus Christ's time in the wilderness, a period of absence and transformation before returning to public ministry. But Liliya left evidence of her presence. Villagers and travelers moving through Eastern European forests during the mid to late 1940s began finding corpses that had been transformed into religious statuary, bodies positioned in poses resembling saints or biblical figures, arranged with care that suggested intention rather than random violence. The corpses weren't hidden or disposed of carelessly. They were displayed, converted into religious art through death. These discoveries created local legends about something haunting the forest. People avoided areas where the statuary corpses appeared. The few who encountered Liliya during this period described a woman who spoke in ways that made you want to do whatever she asked, whose presence carried weight that couldn't be explained by physical threat alone, who seemed to operate according to logic that transcended normal human motivation. This period in the forest prepared her for what came next. When she emerged from years of isolation, she would no longer be killing German soldiers during siege warfare. She would be hunting a different kind of prey. People whose wealth and power made them believe they were untouchable, whose spiritual emptiness left them vulnerable to someone offering meaning through suffering. The wealthy elite of post-war Europe were about to discover that the Angel of Leningrad hadn't died with the war's end. She'd simply found a new battlefield. That explains why the forests of Eastern Europe became her wilderness. But it doesn't explain why people with everything to lose would hand Liliya their fortunes, their bodies, their lives, would smile while cutting off their own fingers because she asked them to. The answer is a lot more uncomfortable than anything we've covered so far. Chapter 3: The Post-War, Predator, and the Spiritual Vacuum. The end of World War II left Europe devastated. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead. The economic and social structures that had organized life before the war had collapsed, requiring rebuilding from foundations that no longer existed. The United States recognized that leaving Europe in ruins would create conditions for instability, potentially allowing communist influence to spread into the power vacuum. The response was massive financial aid. The Marshall Plan provided billions of dollars to help European nations rebuild infrastructure and economies. But there were also more targeted programs. The Mutual Security Act, signed into law by President Truman on October 10, 1951, provided economic assistance specifically aimed at strengthening free nations and allies against Soviet influence. The goal was containing communism through building prosperity that would make Western democratic capitalism appealing compared to Soviet alternatives. Tens of billions of dollars flowed into Europe through these programs. American money funded construction projects, industrial development, and support for businesses and families trying to rebuild lives that war had destroyed. The aid was meant to create stability, opportunity, and gratitude that would align European interests with American geopolitical objectives. But something strange began happening in the early 1950s. Wealthy individuals and families, industrialists, shipping magnates, people who'd either survived the war with fortunes intact or who'd been funded through reconstruction programs to rebuild economic infrastructure, started exhibiting bizarre behavior. They would suddenly begin liquidating assets, selling property, converting investments to cash, accumulating liquid wealth for no apparent business reason. Then they'd start destroying that wealth, burning money, throwing cash into furnaces or bodies of water, spending vast sums in ways that provided no return, no pleasure, no rational benefit whatsoever. Their families and business associates would try to intervene, to understand what was happening. The individuals engaging in this behavior would offer vague explanations about purification, about cutting away the sins of wealth, about divine commands that required sacrifice. Then they would vanish from society entirely, disappearing from their homes, their businesses, their social circles. When bodies eventually surfaced, they were found in conditions that defied conventional criminal profiling. Not murdered in ways that suggested robbery or business rivalry, killed through processes that looked more like ritual sacrifice or extreme self-harm. Bodies were discovered in pieces, with various parts missing, limbs removed, eyes gone, tongues cut out. The violence wasn't frenzied or rage-driven, it was methodical, almost surgical. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. Multiple wealthy individuals across different countries exhibiting the same behavioral progression, liquidating wealth, destroying it, vanishing, dying in similar ways. Something or someone was causing this, and conventional law enforcement struggled to identify what. The Central Intelligence Agency took interest. Missing funds from the Mutual Security Act represented not just economic loss, but potential national security threat. If money meant to rebuild European infrastructure was instead disappearing into some unknown sink, that needed investigation. The CIA couldn't determine where the funds had gone, which suggested either sophisticated theft or destruction on scales that required organized effort. They appointed Agent George Nichols to investigate. His mandate was to trace the missing money and determine whether a single person or organization was responsible for the pattern of wealthy individuals behaving irrationally before dying under suspicious circumstances. Nichols was thorough. He began by reviewing cases of wealthy families whose patriarchs had vanished after exhibiting the strange spending behaviors. He interviewed survivors, business partners, family members, anyone who'd witnessed the behavioral changes before the disappearances. And gradually, a name started appearing with disturbing consistency. People who'd known the victims mentioned a woman. They called her different things: the angel of Leningrad, Sister Liliya, the beloved of God. Descriptions varied, but certain details remained consistent. She was Russian. She spoke with extraordinary persuasiveness. People who encountered her described feeling compelled to do whatever she suggested, and after spending time with her, wealthy individuals would begin exhibiting the destructive behaviors that preceded their deaths. Nichols built a comprehensive background by connecting fragments from different sources. The news article about the feral girl from 1939, records from the St. Gaspar orphanage about a Russian girl who'd learned to speak late but had become remarkably charismatic, war records mentioning the Angel of Leningrad who'd fought during the siege, accounts of religious statuary corpses found in Eastern European forests, and now these post-war deaths of wealthy individuals who all mentioned a Russian woman before they died. He concluded that all of these references described a single person: Liliya Bogomolova, the child discovered in that homemade prison, the orphan who claimed God spoke to her, the ambush predator who'd killed German soldiers, the woman who'd escaped her captors and vanished into the wilderness for years. She'd survived the war and found new prey in the spiritual emptiness of Europe's wealthy elite. Nichols focused on one case in particular: Jacques Treguet, a shipping magnate whose death had been ruled a suicide despite circumstances that made that conclusion almost impossible to accept. Treguet had been found dead with multiple limbs missing, fingers gone, portions of his body removed in ways that suggested extended periods of self-mutilation rather than a single violent event. The official cause of death was asphyxiation rather than blood loss, meaning he'd somehow survived long enough after the mutilations to die from suffocation or strangulation. The ruling that Treguet had done this to himself stretched credibility. Self-amputation of major limbs requires overcoming survival instincts that are among the most powerful biological imperatives humans possess. Pain alone would typically cause shock severe enough to prevent continued self-harm on this scale. Yet the investigation had concluded that no one else was responsible, that Treguet had somehow managed to remove his own body parts before dying. Nichols obtained permission to interview Treguet family valet, one of the few people who'd been present during the months leading up to the magnate's death. When Nichols arrived at the estate and met this man, the first thing he noticed was the mutilation. The valet had been reduced to half a person. His left foot was gone. Only 2 fingers remained on his left hand. One eye had been removed. The injuries were extensive enough that Nichols, who'd seen landmine survivors during the war, noted that even among that population, this level of damage was extraordinary. The valet spoke about Liliya with reverence that bordered on worship. He recited facts about her like gospel, describing her as a saint who'd given his employer spiritual guidance. According to the valet, Liliya had helped Jacques Treguet sacrifice the evils of money and cut away the evils of flesh. The process had been gradual, burning cash in between the removal of fingers, eyes, limbs. Like Build-A-Bear in reverse, Nichols would later note in his reports. Nichols asked why Treguet would agree to such a thing. The valet's answer was simple and delivered with absolute sincerity: because Liliya asked him to. That was the entire explanation. She'd requested that he'd destroy his wealth and mutilate his body, and he'd complied with enthusiasm rather than reluctance. The valet's own injuries existed for the same reason. Liliya had asked him to remove parts of himself, and he'd done so willingly. The valet described being in love with Liliya, though not in a romantic or sexual sense. It was the love of someone who'd encountered something transcendent, something that gave meaning to existence in ways that made previous life feel hollow by comparison. He spoke of her as someone who'd seen God with his own eyes, or eye singular since he only had one remaining. Nichols began experiencing strange symptoms during this interview: dizziness, fever, difficulty keeping his thoughts organized. He wondered if he'd caught some illness, though the onset seemed unusually rapid. His journal entries from this period document increasing mental fog, sentences that trail off mid-thought, concerns that he was losing his ability to think clearly. The valet told him where to find Liliya. She was with one of the Tregway children at a lodge in the mountains, continuing her work of spiritual guidance. He provided specific directions, encouraging Nichols to go meet her himself, suggesting that the agent would understand everything once he experienced her presence directly. Nichols drove to the location. The mountain roads were isolated, winding through terrain where screaming wouldn't carry far enough to reach help. The lodge itself was remote enough that neighbors wouldn't notice unusual activity. It was the kind of place where terrible things could happen without interference. He found her there, Liliya Bogomolova, in person, no longer just a name in reports and whispered accounts. Nichols described her later as a religious parasite, someone who exploited the spiritual vacuum in the hearts of wealthy elite. Post-war Europe had left these people with everything except meaning. They had fortunes rebuilt through American aid. They had comfort and security that most of the population couldn't imagine. But they'd lived through years of horror that money couldn't erase, had seen civilization collapse, had participated in or witnessed atrocities that left psychological scars no amount of wealth could heal. Liliya offered them something their money couldn't buy, a sense that their suffering had purpose, that their guilt could be addressed through concrete action, that God Himself was interested in their redemption. She turned their hunger for spiritual meaning against their own bodies, channeling the need for absolution into self-destruction that she framed as purification. When Nichols met her, Liliya didn't run or resist. She told him calmly that she would allow him to bring her in. The phrasing was significant. She would allow it, as though she held authority in the situation rather than being a suspect facing arrest. But her cooperation came with conditions. She required gifts, not money or material goods. Nichols needed to give her pieces of himself. He had to cut away his own sins under her direction, following guidance that came from God through her voice. Only after he had demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice would she agree to accompany him to wherever he intended to take her. The details of what happened in that mountain lodge aren't fully documented. What's known is that when Agent George Nichols delivered Liliya to Mount Massive Asylum in 1953, he was missing an arm, a leg, and an eye. The same mutilations that had marked the valet, that had killed Jacques Tregway, that characterized all of Liliya's victims, now marked the CIA agent who'd been sent to investigate her. Dr. Rudolf Wernicke met them at Mount Massive. Wernicke was a Nazi scientist who'd been brought to America through Operation Paperclip, the program that recruited German researchers whose expertise was deemed valuable enough to overlook their participation in war crimes. He'd worked on psychological conditioning programs for the Third Reich, and now applied similar methods to American intelligence projects. His expertise in breaking and reshaping human consciousness made him valuable to programs that would eventually become MK Ultra and its corporate successor, Project LATHE. Wernicke's first assumption upon seeing Nichols was that the man had been injured by landmines or artillery during military service. The injuries were consistent with combat trauma, and Nichols had served during the war, making that explanation reasonable. But when Nichols explained what had actually happened, that he'd mutilated himself at the request of the woman he'd brought in, Wernicke's interest sharpened immediately. He'd heard stories about the Angel of Leningrad during his time serving the German military. Officers had spoken with a mix of fear and fascination about the woman who killed Wehrmacht soldiers through ambush tactics that seemed almost supernatural. Encountering her now, seeing the effect she'd had on an experienced CIA agent, confirmed that those stories hadn't been exaggerated propaganda but accurate descriptions of someone genuinely extraordinary. Nichols explained his theory about what had happened to Liliya during the siege of Leningrad. He believed she'd witnessed something in that frozen hell, in wilderness consecrated by the blood of entire nations. The experience had either broken something in her mind or opened her to forces that existed beyond normal human perception. Whether you interpreted her abilities as psychological manipulation or genuine divine communication, the effect was identical. She could make people destroy themselves willingly. Vernica noted that Nichols seemed obsessed with Liliya. The agent's tone when speaking about her carried intensity that went beyond professional interest. He spoke about her with the same reverence the valet had shown, suggesting that even while investigating her, even while understanding intellectually what she was doing, Nichols had fallen under her influence. But Vernica identified something that troubled him more than Nichols's obsession. Liliya being brought to Mount Massive didn't seem like investigative success or fortunate capture. It seemed like something she'd wanted. Vernica suspected that Liliya had allowed herself to be brought in, that she'd cooperated with Nichols because America's wealth and corruption represented opportunities too tempting to resist. Europe's wealthy elite had provided years of victims, but America in the 1950s was the epicenter of post-war prosperity and spiritual emptiness. Corporate executives building fortunes through reconstruction contracts, industrialists profiting from military-industrial complex, wealthy families whose comfort was built on exploitation they preferred not to examine. All of them were potential prey for someone who could weaponize guilt and offer purification through suffering. Mount Massive Asylum gave her access to institutional resources, to staff members who carried their own traumas and spiritual needs, to an environment where her abilities could reach more people than isolated mountain lodges ever could. From Liliya's perspective, assuming she was capable of strategic thinking rather than simply following divine commands, allowing capture might have been the most effective way to position herself in the heart of American institutional power. Vernica understood this. He also understood that containing someone like Liliya would be extraordinarily difficult, but he accepted the challenge, cataloging her into Mount Massive's patient population and beginning the process of determining how to prevent her from converting his entire staff into self-mutilating acolytes. What happened over the next several years would prove Vernica's concerns were entirely justified. Liliya didn't just threaten Mount Massive's operations. She came close to destroying the facility entirely, through methods that required neither violence nor escape. She simply did what she'd always done, offered people meaning through suffering, and watched as they eagerly volunteered to cut away their sins. Chapter 4: Mount Massive and the Contagion of Faith. Liliya arrived at Mount Massive Asylum in 1953 as a patient designated with critical security status. Her files required Dr. Vernica's direct permission for any transfer or significant change in treatment protocols. The designation acknowledged that she represented a threat beyond what typical psychiatric patients posed, though the specific nature of that threat wasn't immediately clear to staff members who hadn't been briefed on her history. She was processed like any other patient. Medical evaluation, psychological assessment, assignment to a housing unit within the asylum's secure wing. The staff who conducted intake noted her missing right hand, the amputation the Nazi officer had performed during the war, and the scars on her neck from where her tongue had been cut out and somehow regrown. They recorded these injuries as evidence of trauma she'd survived, unaware that those mutilations had been turning points in her transformation from soldier to something far more dangerous. During the first weeks, Liliya was quiet and cooperative. She followed instructions, took medication as prescribed, participated in the limited group activities available to high-security patients. Staff members who interacted with her reported that she seemed pleasant, even gentle. She spoke softly when she spoke at all, asked thoughtful questions about their lives, showed interest in their well-being that felt genuine rather than manipulative. This behavior was deliberate. Liliya was assessing her environment, identifying who held power and who felt powerless, determining which staff members carried spiritual hunger that she could feed. She'd learned in post-war Europe that wealthy individuals with external success but internal emptiness made the best victims. At Mount Massive, she discovered that institutional workers, doctors, nurses, administrators who spent their days managing other people's suffering while suppressing their own were equally vulnerable. The first conversions happened gradually. A nurse who'd been treating Liliya mentioned during a casual conversation that she felt guilty about her work, that medicating patients into docility troubled her even though she understood it was necessary. Liliya listened with compassion that the nurse hadn't experienced from colleagues or supervisors. Then Liliya gently suggested that guilt was God's way of calling the nurse toward purification, that feeling bad about participating in the asylum's operations meant she retained a soul worth saving. The nurse began spending extra time with Liliya during rounds, finding excuses to check on her more frequently than security protocols required. Other staff noticed but didn't intervene. A nurse taking special interest in a patient's well-being seemed like dedication rather than warning sign. Within weeks, the nurse began exhibiting behavioral changes. She gave away possessions, speaking about the evils of material attachment. She requested permission to work double shifts without pay, describing it as penance. Then she removed her own left thumb. The mutilation happened at home, using kitchen scissors, performed carefully enough that she didn't bleed to death but painfully enough that she required hospitalization. When questioned about why she'd done it, she explained calmly that Sister Liliya had helped her understand that the thumb represented sins she'd committed with her hands, people she'd hurt, comfort she'd accepted while others suffered. Removing it brought her closer to God. The nurse was institutionalized as a patient rather than dismissed as staff. This was Mount Massive's first mistake. Rather than recognizing Liliya's influence and isolating her immediately, administrators assumed the nurse had suffered a psychological break unrelated to any specific patient interaction. They treated it as an isolated incident of mental illness requiring treatment rather than as evidence of contagion spreading through their facility. More staff members began spending time with Liliya. She never pushed or demanded attention. She simply made herself available, radiating the kind of spiritual certainty that people drowning in moral ambiguity found irresistible. Doctors who supervised experimental treatments that bordered on torture found themselves confessing those doubts to her during what were supposed to be routine patient evaluations. Administrators who'd climbed institutional ladders through compromises that haunted them discovered that Liliya listened without judgment while somehow making them feel deeply judged by divine standards they'd been ignoring. Within 6 months of her arrival at Mount Massive, the facility lost 20% of its operational budget. The money didn't disappear through embezzlement or accounting errors. Staff members were destroying it. Following Liliya's guidance, they burned cash, donated their salaries to causes she suggested, liquidated personal assets, and threw the proceeds into furnaces. They described this behavior as cutting away the sins of wealth, as following God's commands delivered through Sister Liliya's interpretation. The facility also lost 10% of its staff during this period, some through conversion into self-mutilating believers who required institutionalization themselves, others through direct violence. Liliya killed staff members who proved resistant to her influence, but whom she encountered in situations where killing them served some purpose only she understood. She managed to hide blades in her gowns despite regular searches, producing weapons from concealment at moments when supervision lapsed just long enough for her to strike. The corpses of staff members she killed were found transformed into religious statuary, positioned in poses that resembled saints or biblical figures, arranged with the same care she'd shown in the forests of Eastern Europe after the war. These killings weren't frenzied or defensive. They were artistic, almost liturgical, suggesting that Liliya viewed murder as a form of religious expression rather than mere violence. Wernicke recognized the crisis developing but struggled to determine how to contain it. Traditional psychiatric approaches failed because Liliya's influence operated on spiritual rather than psychological levels. Medication didn't reduce her effectiveness. If anything, staff members seemed more susceptible to her when she appeared vulnerable and drugged rather than powerful and threatening. Isolating her completely was impossible without violating protocols that prevented cruel and unusual treatment, and even minimal contact during meal delivery or medical checks gave her enough access to plant seeds that would grow into full conversion later. The administrators who worked most closely with managing Liliya's case were particularly vulnerable. They had access that other staff didn't, spending extended time reviewing her files, attending meetings about containment strategies, discussing her history and methods. This exposure created familiarity that Liliya exploited. Several administrators disappeared from their positions, later found as patients in other wings of the asylum, missing tongues and arms and legs, speaking about Sister Liliya with reverence that suggested they'd achieved the purification they'd been seeking. Doctors and medical staff who'd initially been assigned to treat Liliya became some of her most devoted converts. The psychological profiles that made someone suitable for working at Mount Massive: high tolerance for moral ambiguity, ability to conduct or support ethically questionable research, willingness to participate in programs that used patients as experimental subjects, left these individuals carrying guilt that they'd learned to suppress but never actually resolved. Liliya gave them permission to acknowledge that guilt and address it through concrete physical sacrifice. By the late 1950s, Mount Massive's operations were severely compromised. The facility was still functioning, but significant portions of staff had been converted or killed, replaced by new hires who then became vulnerable to Liliya's influence if they had any contact with her or with the patients who worshipped her. The budget was damaged enough that administrators struggled to maintain basic operations, and morale among remaining staff was terrible. Everyone knew that working at Mount Massive meant potential exposure to someone who could make you cut off your own fingers, while believing it was God's will. Wernicke made the decision to keep Liliya sedated continuously. Massive doses of tranquilizers administered multiple times daily, keeping her in a state that approached catatonia. She was rendered nearly unconscious, her cognitive functions suppressed enough that she couldn't speak coherently or form the relationships that allowed her influence to spread. The sedation required enormous quantities of pharmaceutical resources and constant medical supervision to prevent accidental overdose, but it was the only method that proved effective. Liliya spent the next 5 years in this chemically induced catatonia. The woman who'd survived 3 years of siege warfare, who'd converted wealthy industrialists into willing victims, who'd nearly destroyed Mount Massive through the power of her voice and presence, reduced to a heavily drugged body in a secure cell, kept unconscious because allowing her to wake would restart the contagion. Wernicke told colleagues that Liliya was too dangerous to keep but too interesting to kill. She represented psychological phenomena that his research hadn't fully explained. Her ability to influence others suggested mechanisms that might be replicable if they could be understood and systematized. Keeping her alive meant maintaining the opportunity to study her further, even if that study required keeping her sedated to the point of vegetative existence. The sedation created a holding pattern that couldn't last indefinitely. Mount Massive was spending significant resources maintaining one patient who provided no research value in her current state. Wernicke wanted to keep her for theoretical future study, but institutional pressure to eliminate expensive problems eventually outweighs scientific curiosity. Someone with authority would eventually decide that Liliya needed to be euthanized or transferred somewhere that could afford the costs of containing her. That decision came in 1960 when Silas Knisley walked into Mount Massive requesting her medical records and proposing a transfer that would solve everyone's problems. Knisley worked in human resources and corrections at the Sinyala facility, and he had plans for Sister Liliya Bogomolova that would transform her from an expensive burden into one of the most effective prime assets Project LATHE 2 ever deployed. But understanding what happened at Sinyala requires first recognizing what Wernicke knew and what Knisley thought he knew. The gap between those two sets of information would determine whether Liliya's transfer to Sinyala represented brilliant strategic thinking or the worst mistake Murkoff ever made. Chapter 5: The Transfer and Sinyala's Miscalculation. Silas Knisley reviewed Liliya's file with the confidence of someone who believed he understood what he was reading. The documents described a patient who'd been catatonic for 5 years, who required massive pharmaceutical resources and security protocols that consumed budget without producing research value. From Knisley's perspective, this was exactly what Sinyala specialized in, taking Mount Massive's failures and finding applications that turned liabilities into assets. He'd been negotiating with Dr. Hendrik Joliet Easterman about acquiring new prime assets for Project LATHE 2. The program's existing prime assets, Leland Coyle, Phyllis Futterman, Franco Barbie, were effective but limited in the psychological pressures they could apply. Easterman wanted diversity in the methods used to break reagents, and he'd specifically mentioned interest in acquiring subjects whose influence operated through charisma and manipulation rather than straightforward violence. Liliya's file suggested she fit that profile perfectly. The documented history of converting wealthy individuals and institutional staff into self-mutilating believers indicated extraordinary persuasive abilities. The fact that she'd done this without apparent use of force or drugs meant her methods were psychological or spiritual. Exactly the kind of technique Easterman wanted to study and weaponize. And the fact that she'd been rendered catatonic through sedation suggested that her influence could be controlled through pharmaceutical means, allowing Sinyala to deploy her selectively rather than risking facility-wide contamination. Knisley arranged a meeting with Dr. Wernicke to discuss transfer. The conversation was framed as routine administrative negotiation. Mount Massive had a patient who was expensive to maintain and useless in her current state. Sinyala had programs that might benefit from her unique profile. Arranging transfer would benefit both facilities. Knisley presented the deal as essentially selling a dead dog for the price of a prized horse, suggesting that Sinyala was taking on a burden out of optimism rather than realistic assessment. Wernicke listened to this pitch with amusement. He understood that Knisley had read Liliya's file, but hadn't internalized what those documents actually described. The younger man was treating her as a promising subject whose influence had gotten out of control due to mismanagement, someone who could be deployed effectively if proper protocols were followed. Wernicke knew better. He'd watched Liliya nearly destroy Mount Massive despite every precaution, and he understood that her transfer to Sinyala would likely end disastrously, regardless of how careful Easterman's team was. But Wernicke also wanted to be rid of her. 5 years of maintaining someone in chemical catatonia while watching her consume resources that could support actual research had exhausted his patience. If Sinyala wanted to take responsibility for her, if Easterman thought he could control her when Wernicke couldn't, that was their decision to make. Wernicke would provide the full documentation, warn them explicitly about the dangers, and then wash his hands of responsibility for whatever happened next. He told Knisley the history. the feral girl discovered in a homemade prison, the orphanage where she learned to speak and claimed God's voice guided her, the siege of Leningrad where she became an ambush predator, the mutilation by the Nazi officer and the alleged miracle of her tongue regrowing, the post-war predation on wealthy elite, Agent Nichols arriving at Mount Massive missing limbs after just days in her presence, and then the systematic conversion of Mount Massive's staff, the budget damage, the corpses transformed into religious statuary. Veronica emphasized that wherever Liliya went, she created acolytes. The pattern was invariable. Staff members, doctors, administrators, everyone who spent time around her eventually became either her convert or her victim. All of them ended up mutilated, missing tongues and arms and eyes and legs. In just 6 months, she'd cost Mount Massive 20% of its budget and 10% of its staff. Half of those losses had been people who worked for the facility, professionals who'd been vetted and trained, reduced to self-mutilating believers or corpses arranged in religious poses. The staff losses weren't limited to lower-level workers. Doctors disappeared, administrators woke up one day and decided their hands had sinned, removing fingers while reciting prayers Liliya had taught them. Security personnel, whose job was containing dangerous patients, found themselves believing that the most dangerous patient in the facility was actually a saint offering salvation through suffering. Veronica explained how Liliya kept hiding blades in her gowns. Despite regular searches, they'd search her cell, confiscate everything, ensure she had nothing but fabric and basic necessities. Within days, she'd produce another weapon during some interaction with staff, killing someone who'd let their guard down or who'd believed she was too sedated to be dangerous. The murders were always performed with precision that suggested military training, quick strikes to vital areas, minimal struggle, death coming fast enough that victims couldn't sound alarms. The facility had tried everything. Isolation cells with no human contact beyond meal delivery through slots, continuous camera surveillance, restraints that prevented her from moving freely. None of it worked completely because Liliya only needed moments of opportunity. She could convert someone during a 30-second conversation when staff checked her vital signs. She could plant suggestions that wouldn't fully activate for weeks, then manifest as sudden certainty that God required them to mutilate themselves. The only solution that worked was keeping her unconscious. Massive sedation administered continuously, reducing her to a state where she couldn't speak, could barely process sensory input, existed more as vegetative presence than as conscious person. Even maintaining this state was dangerous. Medical staff who administered her medications were at risk of exposure during brief moments when she was alert enough to make eye contact or speak a few words. But it was the only method that prevented her from destroying the facility entirely. Veronica looked directly at Nicely while delivering his conclusion. They weren't selling Signala, a dead frog. They were sending a viper. Liliya wasn't some burned-out subject whose charisma had faded into manageable influence. She was the most dangerous person Veronica had encountered in decades of working with psychological conditioning and mind control. He was fascinated by what she could do, and desperately wanted her gone before she managed to convert him too. Knisley listened to all of this and interpreted it as exaggeration born from poor containment protocols. He believed Veronica was overselling the danger to justify Mount Massive's failure to utilize her effectively. Signala had successfully deployed multiple prime assets whose violence and psychological manipulation had seemed uncontrollable before proper management. Coyle had been a rogue cop who'd killed multiple people, including his own wives. Gooseberry was genuinely insane, with dissociative identity disorder that made her unpredictable. Barbie was an emotionally absent killer with no conscience. All of them had been integrated into trial programs, where they functioned according to Easterman's designs. Liliya would be the same. Yes, she'd caused problems at Mount Massive, but that facility wasn't designed for the kind of controlled deployment Signala specialized in. She'd be kept sedated except during trial programs, where her exposure to reagents would be limited and supervised. Her ability to convert people would be channeled toward breaking reagents who were already psychologically vulnerable, rather than allowed to spread through staff populations. And if problems developed, Signala had pharmaceutical resources and security protocols that exceeded what Mount Massive could implement. The meeting ended with arrangements finalized for Liliya's transfer. Kneisely left satisfied that he'd negotiated a valuable acquisition for reasonable cost. Wernicke watched him leave and felt something close to relief, mixed with scientific curiosity, about how badly this would eventually go wrong. He had no moral qualms about shipping Liliya to another facility where she'd likely destroy more lives. His only investment was in being rid of her, before she managed to convert him into someone who'd cut off his own fingers while praising God. The transfer happened in early 1960. Liliya was transported from Mount Massive to the Signala facility in Arizona under maximum security protocols. She remained heavily sedated throughout the journey, her consciousness suppressed to the point where she couldn't resist or influence the personnel managing her transport. She arrived at Signala as a chemically subdued body rather than as the charismatic predator who'd terrorized two institutions before. Easterman reviewed her complete file upon arrival. Unlike Kneisly, Easterman had enough experience with psychological manipulation to recognize that Wernicke's warnings weren't exaggeration. Liliya represented genuine danger that would require unprecedented caution, but Easterman also saw opportunity that excited him more than the risk deterred him. If they could understand how she influenced people, if they could identify the mechanisms that made her voice so persuasive, they might be able to replicate those effects through training or pharmaceutical enhancement. He designed a role specifically for her. She wouldn't be wasted in a single trial environment. Instead, she would be stationed centrally, in the very heart of the facility, where she could influence every reagent who passed through. She would become the nurse, the administrator of the pharmacy, a position that suggested healing while concealing the spiritual destruction she would perform. The environment would incorporate elements from her history, Orthodox Christian imagery, references to the siege of Leningrad, spaces that evoked both pilgrimage and purgatory, and Liliya would be positioned as a spiritual guide, offering reagents purification through suffering. Easterman believed he could control her through careful pharmaceutical management and limited exposure protocols. Reagents would interact with her in structured sessions where her influence could be directed toward therapeutic goals, breaking down psychological defenses, creating internalized guilt, making subjects more vulnerable to conditioning. Staff would have minimal direct contact, receiving instructions and observations through intermediaries to prevent the kind of conversion that had devastated Mount Massive. The fundamental miscalculation underlying all of this planning was the assumption that institutional control could contain divine conviction. Easterman and Kneisly were treating Liliya as a subject whose psychological techniques could be managed through scientific protocols. They'd built careers on breaking and reprogramming human consciousness, and they believed that her charisma was just another form of psychological manipulation that could be understood and controlled. What they failed to account for was the possibility that Liliya actually believed she spoke with God's voice. Whether that belief was delusional or accurate was irrelevant to its effects. Someone who genuinely believes they're following divine commands operates according to logic that institutional authority can't predict or contain. You can't negotiate with someone whose actions are directed by what they perceive as cosmic imperative. You can't control someone who views earthly consequences as irrelevant compared to spiritual judgment. Signala's staff would learn this lesson gradually, and painfully over the years that followed. But in early 1960, as they processed Liliya into the facility and began designing the trial program she'd inhabit, they believed they were acquiring a powerful tool that would advance Project LATHE 2's objectives. They had no idea they'd actually imported something that would eventually threaten the facility's integrity in ways none of the other prime assets ever approached. The resort was built. Liliya was installed within it, and Murkoff's most dangerous experiment since the morphogenic engine slowly began waking up from 5 years of chemically induced sleep. Chapter 6: The Resort and the Architecture of Spiritual Breaking. Her domain at Signala, the pharmacy, was situated directly within the central hub where reagents lived between trials. It wasn't a sprawling trial environment like the police station or fun park, but a station of necessity where every reagent eventually had to come for survival. The architecture was clinical, cold, and precise. Stainless steel counters, reinforced glass, and rows of medication that promised relief but delivered dependency. The lighting was harsh and clinical, leaving no shadows for secrets to hide. Religious imagery was absent from the walls but present in her presence. The way she arranged the vials, the way she looked at the reagents who approached her counter. The space was designed not for comfort but for transaction. A place where the desperate came to trade their tokens for the means to survive another day. Reagents approached the pharmacy after returning from other trial programs. They'd survived Coyle's interrogations in the police station mock-up, endured Gooseberry's nightmare orphanage, possibly faced Barbie's devil's therapy. Each experience had stripped away psychological defenses, created vulnerabilities, established patterns where resistance brought worse outcomes than compliance. By the time reagents reached the resort, they were already broken in ways that made them susceptible to what Liliya offered. They were told the resort was a place of healing, somewhere they could address the spiritual damage accumulated during previous trials. The framing suggested that submitting to Liliya's guidance would provide relief rather than additional torture, that the suffering she prescribed would be redemptive rather than destructive. Reagents who were desperate for anything resembling hope or meaning found this message appealing even when they intellectually understood that nothing at Signala existed to help them. Liliya was kept sedated, except during scheduled sessions. Medical staff would reduce her pharmaceutical intake several hours before reagents were scheduled to interact with her, allowing her consciousness to emerge gradually while monitoring for signs that she might convert the staff administering her medication. The protocol required multiple personnel present during wake-up procedures, with strict limits on eye contact or verbal interaction that might give her openings to plant suggestions. When reagents encountered her, they met someone who seemed gentle and genuinely concerned about their well-being. Liliya spoke softly, asked about their suffering, validated their experiences without dismissing or minimizing what they'd endured. She offered something none of the other prime assets provided: compassion that felt real rather than performed, spiritual certainty that seemed to come from genuine faith rather than institutional script, recognition of their humanity at moments when everything else at Signala treated them as experimental subjects. This compassion was the weapon. Reagents who'd been terrorized by Coyle, confused by Gooseberry, judged by Barbie, encountered in Liliya someone who seemed to offer salvation. She'd framed their previous trials as preparation for purification, suggesting that the suffering hadn't been meaningless but had instead stripped away the lies they'd been telling themselves about who they were. Now they were ready for real transformation, for cutting away the sins that trapped them, for becoming clean enough to hear God's voice, themselves. The mutilation she prescribed began small. A finger, perhaps. Just one, usually one already damaged or injured during previous trials. Liliya would explain that this finger represented something the reagent had done with their hands, someone they'd hurt, something they'd stolen, comfort they'd taken while others suffered. Removing it would demonstrate commitment to purification, would prove they were serious about transformation rather than just seeking comfort. Most reagents refused initially, but the resort didn't provide exits until trials were completed, and completing trials required following Liliya's instructions. Reagents who refused her guidance found themselves cut off from the resources they needed to survive the trials, with Liliya's presence looming over the sleep room even when she wasn't speaking. A silent reminder that the only path forward required sacrifice. Combined with their existing psychological damage and the desperate hope that maybe this time compliance would actually lead to relief, many eventually agreed. The first mutilation created a threshold that made subsequent ones easier. Once a reagent had already removed one finger at Liliya's request, removing another felt less significant. After all, they'd already crossed the line. They'd already damaged themselves. Continuing in the same direction required less psychological resistance than stopping and acknowledging that the previous mutilation had been meaningless rather than redemptive. Liliya used religious language throughout. She spoke of cutting away sin, of making the body clean enough to house the spirit properly, of following the example of saints and martyrs who'd mortified their flesh to draw closer to God. The framing provided narrative structure that transformed self-harm into sacred ritual, that made mutilation feel meaningful rather than insane. Reagents who might have recognized they were being manipulated if the instructions had been delivered as mere commands found themselves believing that maybe this really was a path towards something better. The sessions were carefully timed and supervised. Murkoff's staff monitored reagents' physiological responses, intervening if subjects reached dangerous shock or blood loss levels. They provided medical care between mutilations, keeping reagents stable enough to continue participating without dying from complications. The goal was prolonged spiritual destruction rather than quick physical death, and that required maintaining subjects at levels where they could still be influenced by Liliya's voice. Some reagents emerged from the resort having removed multiple fingers, sometimes entire hands, occasionally eyes or portions of tongues. They carried physical damage that would mark them permanently, injuries that no amount of future therapy could erase. But the deeper damage was psychological. They'd mutilated themselves while believing it was holy, had done terrible things to their own bodies, while convinced it brought them closer to God. Reconciling that experience with normal reality afterwards was nearly impossible. Other reagents died during the resort, medical monitoring failed, or subjects experienced complications that escalated faster than staff could manage. Bodies were removed and processed through whatever disposal methods Signala used for failed subjects. Liliya showed no particular emotional response to these deaths. From her perspective, those who died had either achieved purification through suffering or hadn't been spiritually ready for what God was calling them toward. Either way, their fate was determined by divine will rather than earthly circumstance. The few reagents who successfully resisted Liliya's influence through the resort faced different challenges. She would identify resistors quickly. They were the ones who maintained skepticism even when desperate, who questioned her authority even while seeking comfort, who wouldn't commit to the first small mutilation no matter how long she waited. For these reagents, Liliya changed tactics. Rather than offering spiritual guidance, she became prophetic and condemning, declaring that their refusal proved they were damned, that God had already judged them unworthy, that their suffering would continue eternally because they'd rejected the only path toward redemption. This condemnation created different kind of psychological damage. Resistors left the resort having successfully avoided mutilation, but carrying the weight of having been declared spiritually worthless by someone whose voice carried bizarre authority, even when you recognized intellectually that she might be insane. The experience planted doubt that festered. What if she was right? What if refusing to mutilate yourself actually did prove some fundamental spiritual failure? What if you'd chosen damnation through trying to maintain sanity? Easterman studied the resort's outcomes with fascination. Liliya was achieving exactly what he'd hoped, breaking reagents in ways that combined physical damage with spiritual destruction, creating subjects whose sense of self was so thoroughly compromised that they'd accept almost any identity Murkoff wanted to impose afterwards. The mutilations served as permanent reminders of their compliance, visible proof that they'd already surrendered their bodily autonomy in service to someone else's vision. That psychological pattern could be redirected toward serving other authorities once the resort was complete. But Easterman also noticed concerning patterns. Staff who administered the resort, even with minimal contact protocols, were beginning to exhibit behaviors that resembled early-stage conversion. They spoke about Liliya with unusual respect, described her spiritual guidance as genuinely insightful, made comments suggesting they were considering whether their own lives might benefit from purification. None had progressed to self-mutilation yet, but the trajectory was clear. Liliya was starting to influence Sinyala's personnel despite all precautions designed to prevent exactly that outcome. Medical staff who reduced her sedation before trial sessions and increased it afterwards reported feeling strange compulsions during those procedures. Thoughts about whether they deserved the comfort of having all their fingers, whether their eyes had witnessed things that damned them, whether God might speak to them too if they listened carefully enough. These thoughts were intrusive and distressing, recognized as not quite their own even while feeling compelling. Several staff members requested transfer away from the resort assignments, citing psychological toll that exceeded what working with other prime assets demanded. Easterman responded by increasing Liliya's sedation levels and reducing her conscious time even more strictly. She would be woken only for the minimum duration necessary to interact with reagents, kept unconscious the rest of the time, denied any opportunity to develop ongoing relationships with personnel. The protocol made the resort less effective. Reagents benefited less from shorter sessions where Liliya had less time to establish rapport, but it was necessary to prevent her from converting staff at rates that would compromise facility operations. This created a frustrating tension. Liliya was extraordinarily effective at breaking reagents, potentially the most psychologically damaging prime asset Sinyala had deployed. But utilizing her effectiveness required giving her consciousness and exposure, which immediately created staff conversion risk. Keeping her safely contained required sedation that limited her usefulness. There was no equilibrium point where she provided maximum benefit without maximum danger. Years passed, with this uncomfortable management continuing. The resort remained active, but with careful restrictions. Liliya spent most of her existence unconscious, woken briefly to destroy reagents, psychologically before being returned to chemical catatonia. The arrangement was unsustainable long term. Eventually, either the conversion risk would force them to eliminate her, or the potential research value would push them to give her more freedom. Or something would break the stalemate in ways nobody predicted. What actually broke the stalemate was institutional collapse rather than deliberate decision. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Project LATHE 2 was facing external pressures that threatened Sinyala's continued operation. Congressional investigations into MK Ultra had exposed some CIA programs, creating climate where illegal human experimentation attracted dangerous attention. Murkoff's corporate leadership was reevaluating whether maintaining expensive secret facilities with high liability risk still served their interests. The political and economic landscape was shifting in ways that made projects like Sinyala look like potential disasters, rather than valuable research programs. Sinyala's operations began winding down gradually. Some programs were closed entirely. Prime assets were processed for either permanent institutionalization or, in rare cases, carefully managed release into circumstances where they couldn't reveal facility details. Reagents who'd survived trials faced uncertain futures. Some were genuinely released, as the program had always promised, though with psychological damage that made reintegration nearly impossible. Others were retained indefinitely, or disappeared into disposal processes nobody documented officially. Liliya remained sedated through this transition period. Nobody had clear plans for what to do with her. She couldn't be released, even without facility details to reveal. She'd immediately begin converting whoever she encountered. She couldn't be transferred to standard psychiatric facilities, because no ordinary asylum could contain her without repeating Mount Massive's experience. She couldn't be simply eliminated without paperwork that somebody would eventually have to justify. So she existed in limbo, maintained in chemical catatonia, while administrators argued about her fate. The eventual decision, reached through the kind of bureaucratic process that avoids responsibility through diffusion, was to keep her indefinitely. Murkoff maintained skeleton operations at a reduced version of Signala, and Liliya was kept there as a permanent sedated patient. The arrangement was expensive and pointless. They weren't conducting research on her or utilizing her in any program, but it avoided the complications that would come from any other option. Decades passed. The world changed. The Cold War ended. Technology advanced. The specific fears that had motivated Project LATHE became historical rather than current concerns. But Liliya remained, kept unconscious, in a facility that was increasingly irrelevant to Murkoff's contemporary operations, until someone at Murkoff's corporate headquarters realized they were still maintaining this facility and still paying for expensive sedation of patients nobody could explain. Questions were asked about why resources were being allocated to programs that no longer served business purposes. Administrators who'd inherited these operations rather than creating them reviewed files and discovered that Signala was holding several former prime assets who'd never been properly processed out when the original programs closed. This review would eventually lead to decisions about Liliya's fate decades after she'd last been conscious for meaningful periods, and those decisions would resurrect the resort program in new form, bringing Liliya back into active deployment for audiences who had no idea what they were walking into. But we're not there yet. Before we reach that contemporary resurrection, we need to understand what Liliya actually represents. Not just what she does to reagents or staff, but what her existence reveals about faith, manipulation, trauma, and the question of whether genuine spiritual experience can be distinguished from psychological weaponization. That's where things get genuinely uncomfortable, because the answer might suggest that the distinction doesn't exist. Chapter 7: Faith, Manipulation, and the Question Nobody Wants to Answer. Understanding what Liliya actually does requires confronting a question that makes most people uncomfortable. When someone claims to hear God's voice and uses that claim to convince others to mutilate themselves, are we witnessing psychological manipulation or genuine spiritual experience being weaponized? The easy answer treats the question as already resolved. Obviously, Liliya is manipulating people through sophisticated psychological techniques. She identifies vulnerable individuals, offers them meaning during moments of crisis, uses religious language to reframe self-harm as sacred ritual, and exploits the human need for redemption to make victims complicit in their own destruction. This explanation is comforting because it preserves the boundary between real faith and dangerous delusion, between authentic spiritual experience and pathological belief. But Liliya's history resists that clean categorization. She spent 10 years in sensory deprivation that should have prevented normal psychological development. She learned language rapidly after claiming God taught her to speak. She survived 3 years during the siege of Leningrad using tactics that required patience and discipline most trained soldiers couldn't sustain. Her tongue was cut out, and then she could speak again, claiming it had regrown through divine intervention. She walked from Paris to St. Petersburg as a teenager with no resources during one of the most dangerous periods in European history. Every piece of her biography contains elements that shouldn't have been possible according to normal expectations about human capability and survival. Either she's extraordinarily fortunate in ways that approach statistical impossibility, or something protected her through circumstances that killed millions of others. The question of whether that something was divine intervention or just remarkable luck and skill determines whether her claims about hearing God's voice deserve serious consideration or immediate dismissal. Most psychiatric frameworks would diagnose Liliya with religious delusions. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual defines delusions as fixed, false beliefs that persist despite contrary evidence. Believing God speaks to you directly, believing you're the Russian Joan of Arc, believing you can heal through prescribing mutilation, these would typically be classified as grandiose delusions with religious content, consistent with schizophrenia or delusional disorder. But those diagnoses assume the beliefs are false. They start from the position that God doesn't actually speak to people, that divine missions are, by definition, delusional, that religious experiences reflect brain chemistry, rather than legitimate perception of transcendent reality. If you begin with materialist assumptions about consciousness and spirituality, then Liliya is obviously mentally ill, and her victims are suffering from induced delusional disorder, where they adopt her false beliefs through prolonged exposure. The uncomfortable alternative is that materialist assumptions might be incomplete. Religious traditions across cultures and millennia describe individuals who hear divine voices, who receive missions from higher powers, who perform actions that seem insane by worldly standards, but that serve spiritual purposes beyond human comprehension. Prophets, mystics, saints, these figures are celebrated in retrospect, but would likely be diagnosed with mental illness if evaluated according to psychiatric criteria during their active ministries. Joan of Arc heard voices telling her to lead French armies against the English. She was a teenage peasant girl with no military training, who convinced hardened soldiers to follow her into battle, based on her certainty that God had commanded her to save France. She succeeded in ways that shouldn't have been possible, achieving military victories that changed the course of the 100 Years' War. Then she was captured, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake. Centuries later, she was canonized as a saint. During her lifetime, was Joan of Arc mentally ill or divinely inspired? The question can't be answered through psychiatric evaluation alone, because the answer depends on metaphysical assumptions about whether divine communication is possible. If God doesn't speak to humans, Joan was delusional. If God does speak to select individuals for specific purposes, Joan might have been genuinely receiving divine guidance. The evidence, her military successes, her unwavering conviction, her willingness to die for her beliefs, doesn't resolve the question because both interpretations fit the same facts. Liliya presents the identical problem. She claims to be the Russian Joan of Arc, describes receiving instructions from God, survived circumstances that killed millions, and demonstrates abilities that consistently exceed normal expectations. She's also responsible for dozens or hundreds of deaths, has caused immense suffering, and uses religious language to convince vulnerable people to destroy themselves. Both sets of facts are true simultaneously. Psychiatric frameworks would emphasize the harm she causes and diagnose accordingly. Religious frameworks might acknowledge the harm, while suggesting that prophetic figures often bring disruption that looks evil from worldly perspective but serves divine purposes that humans can't fully understand. Easterman and the researchers at Signala tried to take a middle position, treating her as psychologically explainable, while recognizing that her influence exceeded what their models predicted. What made Liliya effective wasn't just her technique. Plenty of cult leaders and manipulative personalities use similar methods, love bombing vulnerable people, creating dependency through emotional manipulation, using religious language to make harmful requests seem sacred. But most of those figures eventually face limits. Their influence extends only to people who choose to remain in their proximity. Law enforcement or concerned family members can intervene. The manipulation is effective but ultimately bounded by practical constraints. Liliya's influence seemed to bypass those constraints. People who encountered her briefly, who understood intellectually that she was dangerous, who had every reason to resist, still found themselves considering her suggestions, feeling compelled to follow instructions that contradicted their self-preservation instincts. Agent Nichols was an experienced CIA operative trained to resist psychological manipulation. He investigated Liliya knowing she was dangerous. He still mutilated himself at her request within days of meeting her. This pattern happened repeatedly across different contexts with different populations. Wealthy industrialists who'd survived wartime scarcity and built post-war fortunes through ruthless pragmatism. Mount massive staff who worked daily with manipulative psychiatric patients. Signala personnel who were explicitly warned about her capabilities and assigned to implement protocols designed to prevent conversion. All of them eventually succumbed to her influence at rates that suggested something beyond garden variety psychological manipulation. One explanation focuses on timing and vulnerability. Liliya targeted people during moments of crisis when their normal defensive structures were compromised. The wealthy industrialists carried guilt about surviving and prospering while millions died. Mount Massive staff struggled with moral injuries from participating in ethically questionable research. Signala personnel faced cognitive dissonance about working for programs that tortured human subjects. Liliya offered all of them what they desperately needed, a framework that acknowledged their guilt, provided concrete path toward redemption, and suggested their suffering could serve meaningful purpose. This explanation treats her effectiveness as primarily opportunistic. She was skilled at identifying existing wounds and deepening them, at offering solutions that felt redemptive while actually being destructive. Anyone with her combination of childhood trauma, survival experience, and apparent lack of conventional empathy could potentially develop similar abilities given the right circumstances and victims. Her influence was powerful but ultimately explicable through standard psychological mechanisms. The alternative explanation is more disturbing. Perhaps Liliya's voice actually carried something that normal human voices don't. Whether you call it spiritual authority, divine anointing, or some poorly understood aspect of consciousness that can be transmitted through speech, the effect was that people recognized her words as containing truth that superseded rational analysis. Not truth in the sense of factual accuracy, but truth in the deeper sense of ultimate meaning and purpose. Religious language has terminology for this phenomenon. The idea of a prophetic voice, words spoken with authority that transcends the speaker's personal credibility. The concept of anointing, where divine power works through someone in ways that produce effects beyond their natural abilities. The recognition of holiness, where people instinctively respond to someone who carries genuine spiritual weight, regardless of whether that person is morally good or psychologically healthy. If Liliya possessed this kind of authority, whether through divine assignment or through some other mechanism, then resistance became far more difficult. You weren't just fighting against persuasive arguments or emotional manipulation. You were fighting against something that resonated at levels where rational defenses didn't operate, that addressed spiritual hunger most people didn't even recognize they carried, that offered meaning in ways that made worldly concerns seem trivial by comparison. This creates genuinely troubling implications. If spiritual authority exists, and can be possessed by people who use it to cause terrible harm, then the relationship between holiness and goodness becomes far more complicated than most religious frameworks acknowledge. Saints are supposed to be morally exemplary as well as spiritually powerful. Prophets might be flawed humans, but their flaws are meant to serve as obstacles they overcome through faith rather than as tools they weaponize against others. Liliya was neither saint nor prophet in any conventional sense. She carried what appeared to be genuine spiritual authority and used it to convince people to mutilate themselves. She spoke with certainty that suggested access to transcendent truth and directed that truth toward destructive ends. She demonstrated abilities that exceeded psychological explanation and applied those abilities toward creating suffering rather than alleviating it. Religious traditions have categories for this: false prophets, demonic deception, spiritual authority that comes from dark sources rather than divine ones. But those categories assume clear moral opposition between good and evil spiritual powers, where testing the spirits reveals which authority someone actually serves. Liliya resisted that binary categorization. She spoke Christian religious language, referenced God and saints, and redemption. She framed her instructions as serving divine purposes. The suffering she prescribed was always presented as purification rather than punishment. The question of whether she believed this herself, or was cynically using religious language to manipulate victims, can't be definitively answered. Her childhood, isolation meant she developed psychological frameworks without normal socialization. Her claim that God taught her to speak after years of being unable to communicate suggests she genuinely experienced something she interpreted as divine intervention. Her survival through circumstances that killed millions around her would reasonably create belief that she was protected for some purpose. From the inside of that experience, Liliya might truly believe she serves God's will. The fact that her service produces terrible outcomes wouldn't necessarily contradict that belief. Religious traditions are full of stories where divine purposes require suffering, where God tests people through trials that look cruel from limited human perspective, where prophets are called to deliver harsh judgments that cause pain in service of larger spiritual goals. From outside that framework, Liliya looks like someone whose childhood trauma and psychological damage created grandiose religious delusions that she then weaponized against vulnerable people. The religious language is rationalization for pathological needs to control and destroy. The apparent spiritual authority is actually sophisticated psychological manipulation. The survival and successes that seem miraculous were luck and skill, misinterpreted through delusional belief structure. Both interpretations fit the available evidence. The facts about her life, her abilities, and her effects on others don't definitively resolve whether she's genuinely in contact with divine reality or profoundly mentally ill, and that ambiguity is precisely what makes her so disturbing and so effective. People encountering Liliya couldn't be certain which interpretation was correct. That uncertainty created openings her influence could exploit. Even people who leaned toward the mental illness explanation couldn't fully dismiss the possibility that she might actually hear something real. Even people who wanted to believe she was divinely inspired couldn't ignore the terrible outcomes her guidance produced. The tension between those possibilities made resistance harder because you could never be completely sure you weren't rejecting genuine spiritual truth. Easterman recognized this dynamic but couldn't systematize it. He wanted to understand Liliya's methods well enough to replicate them, to train ordinary people to produce similar effects through learned techniques. But everything he documented about her approach, the tone of voice, the specific language patterns, the timing of suggestions, failed to produce comparable results when others tried implementing them. Something about Liliya herself made the difference, something that couldn't be reduced to mere technique. This irreducibility is what ultimately made her both the most valuable and most dangerous prime asset Signala ever held. She was uniquely effective, achieving psychological destruction that no other prime asset approached. But she was also impossible to control completely because the source of her effectiveness remained mysterious enough that safeguards couldn't address it fully. You can protect against known psychological manipulation techniques. You can't protect against something that might be genuine spiritual authority if you don't know whether such things exist. The question of whether Liliya Bogomolova was a prophet or a monster can't be answered through investigation of her history or analysis of her methods. It can only be answered by resolving deeper metaphysical questions about the nature of consciousness, the possibility of divine communication, and whether spiritual authority can be real while also being destructive. Those questions exceed what psychiatric diagnosis or institutional containment can address, which means the only certainty is that wherever Liliya goes, people suffer in ways they believe are meaningful. Whether that suffering actually serves divine purposes or whether it's just exploitation of wounded people looking for meaning in their pain. We can describe what happens, but we can't definitively say what it means. And that ambiguity is the real horror at her center. She forces you to confront possibilities you'd prefer to dismiss, questions you'd rather not ask, uncertainties about the relationship between faith and madness that most people avoid by assuming they're clearly distinct categories. Liliya exists in the space where those categories overlap, and her presence makes that space impossible to ignore. Chapter 8: The Resurrection and the Modern Resort. For decades, Liliya existed in a state that resembled death more than life. Chemically maintained unconsciousness, her body kept alive through medical intervention while her consciousness was suppressed to near non-existence. The facility that contained her operated on minimal staff, maintaining skeleton operations that served no clear purpose beyond avoiding the complications that would come from shutting down completely. The world moved on without her. The Cold War ended, the Soviet Union collapsed, the geopolitical anxieties that had motivated programs like MK Ultra and Project LATHE became historical rather than contemporary concerns. New technologies and new fears replaced old ones. The specific methods Signala had developed for psychological conditioning seemed quaint compared to what modern surveillance and information control could achieve. But Murkoff Corporation never fully abandoned the research. They'd invested too much into understanding how to break and reprogram human consciousness to simply walk away from that knowledge. The techniques developed at Signala were preserved in corporate archives, studied by researchers who worked on contemporary applications, maintained as intellectual property that might prove valuable even if the original facility was defunct. By the early 2020s, Murkoff had developed new programs that updated Project LATHE's core concepts for contemporary contexts. The Outlast Trials emerged as a modern iteration, still using psychological torture and conditioning, still deploying prime assets to break subjects, but now with improved pharmaceutical interventions, better monitoring technology, and operational structures that learned from previous programs' mistakes. Someone reviewing old Signala files during this development discovered references to Liliya Bogomolova. The documentation described a prime asset whose psychological effectiveness had exceeded all other subjects, who'd achieved reagent breaking rates that nothing else in the program matched, who'd been so dangerous that she'd spent most of her time sedated to prevent facility-wide conversion. The question naturally arose whether she still existed, whether she could be utilized in contemporary programs, whether the decades of unconsciousness had neutralized the danger enough to make deployment viable. Investigation confirmed she was still alive, still sedated, still maintained in what remained of the old Signala facility. Her medical costs were insignificant compared to Murkoff's overall budget, but the fact that they were still paying to keep someone unconscious for no clear reason, attracted attention from administrators looking to optimize resource allocation. The decision to wake her was controversial within Murkoff's research divisions. Personnel who'd worked at Signala during her active period or who'd reviewed the historical files opposed it strenuously. They argued that Liliya had nearly destroyed two facilities, that no containment protocols had proven reliable, that deploying her in contemporary programs would risk everything for uncertain benefit. The psychological damage she'd inflicted on previous reagents was exceptional, yes, but modern pharmaceutical and psychological techniques could achieve similar results with far less danger. But other administrators saw opportunity that outweighed risk. The Outlast Trials was meant to create cutting-edge psychological conditioning that exceeded anything previous programs had achieved, having access to the most effective prime asset in Murkoff's history, someone whose methods remained incompletely understood and therefore potentially revealed something valuable about consciousness manipulation, justified taking calculated risks. Modern monitoring technology and pharmaceutical controls were far superior to what Signala had available in the 1960s. They could deploy her in more controlled ways, limiting exposure and managing danger more effectively. The decision was made to wake Liliya and integrate her into the Outlast Trials. The resort program would be redesigned using contemporary facilities while maintaining the core elements that had made it effective. And after decades of forced unconsciousness, Sister Liliya Bogomolova would be given permission to speak God's words once again. The wake-up process was gradual. Medical teams reduced her sedation over weeks, allowing her consciousness to emerge slowly while monitoring for any signs of catastrophic neurological damage from prolonged chemical suppression. Decades of induced catatonia should have caused severe cognitive impairment. Brain tissue requires stimulation to maintain function, and extended periods of unconsciousness typically produce permanent deficits even when the body remains alive. Liliya woke up as though no time had passed. Her first words upon regaining consciousness were prayers in Russian, delivered with the same certainty that had marked her voice before decades of sedation. Medical staff monitoring her awakening reported feeling immediate unease, describing her presence as carrying weight that made them want to leave the room despite recognizing that response as irrational. Cognitive testing revealed no apparent damage. Her memory of events before sedation was intact. Her language abilities were preserved. Her reasoning showed no signs of impairment. Whatever the decades of unconsciousness should have done to her brain, they hadn't. She functioned as though she'd woken from a normal sleep rather than from decades of chemical suppression. She asked where she was and what year it was. When told she'd been unconscious since the 1960s, that decades had passed, that the world she'd known was gone, she received this information with equanimity that disturbed the medical personnel more than distress would have. Liliya acknowledged that time had passed, but showed no particular concern about what she'd missed. From her perspective, God's mission for her remained unchanged, regardless of how many years had elapsed. If she'd been kept asleep, that served divine purposes she didn't need to understand. Now she was awake, which meant God had work for her to do. The psychological evaluation conducted during this period confirmed what historical files had documented. Liliya believed with absolute certainty that she heard God's voice, that she served divine purposes, that the suffering she prescribed was holy purification rather than torture. She showed no guilt about the people she'd killed or the victims she'd convinced to mutilate themselves. From her framework, those individuals had either achieved redemption through their suffering or had failed tests that proved they weren't among God's chosen. Either way, their fates were determined by spiritual realities beyond her responsibility. The evaluators noted that Liliya's belief structure was internally consistent in ways that made it difficult to challenge through rational argument. She wasn't defensive about her convictions or eager to convert the people evaluating her. She simply stated what she understood to be true with the calmness of someone describing obvious facts. When asked how she knew God spoke to her, rather than experiencing psychological delusions, she pointed to her survival and abilities as evidence. How else had she learned to speak after years of isolation? How had she survived the siege of Leningrad? How had her tongue regrown after being cut out? The evaluators had no compelling answers to these questions that didn't involve either accepting supernatural claims or attributing everything to coincidence. They concluded that Liliya remained exactly as dangerous as historical documentation suggested, that she genuinely believed her religious claims, and that deploying her in the Outlast Trials would produce exceptional results while creating exceptional risks. Murkoff's leadership approved deployment with strict protocols. Liliya would be kept sedated except during trial sessions. Her exposure to any individual reagent would be time limited. Her interactions with staff would be minimized and conducted through barriers when possible. Medical monitoring would track her consciousness levels constantly, with automated systems capable of administering sedatives if she remained alert beyond scheduled windows. And her physical containment would include isolation measures that prevented her voice from reaching anyone not explicitly intended to hear it. The pharmacy was reestablished in the modern facility, placing her once again at the heart of the reagent ecosystem within the sleep room. The environment was updated with contemporary technology, but the core dynamic remained. She was the gatekeeper of survival, the one person every reagent had to face. Religious imagery remained central, updated to include Orthodox Christian aesthetics that Liliya's background made particularly effective. Reagents, the term was preserved from the original Signala programs, entered the resort after already being processed through other trials. They'd faced Coyle's electrical torture in distorted police environments. They'd survived Mother Gooseberry's nightmarish orphanage. They'd possibly encountered Franco Barbai's cold evaluation in the docks. Each experience had carved away pieces of their psychological defenses, created trauma that left them vulnerable to anyone offering meaning or relief. The pharmacy was presented as a neutral ground, a place where reagents could obtain the rigs and supplies necessary to survive the trials. Liliya was introduced as a spiritual guide, whose wisdom came from surviving extraordinary suffering, whose insights could help them process trauma and find purification. The framing was deliberately ambiguous about whether this was psychological treatment or religious ministry, allowing reagents to interpret her role according to whatever framework made them most receptive. When reagents met Liliya, they encountered someone unlike any other prime asset. She didn't threaten or intimidate. She didn't perform cruelty as entertainment or judge them with institutional authority. She spoke with quiet intensity about recognizing their pain, about understanding that they'd been brought to this place for purposes beyond the official explanations, about God's interest in their transformation. Her voice carried the same quality that had made her effective decades earlier. People listening described feeling like she saw through performed identities to some truer self underneath. Like her words addressed parts of them they kept hidden from everyone, including themselves. The effect was magnetic, even for reagents who wanted to resist, who understood intellectually that she was dangerous, who'd been warned through facility rumors about what happened in the resort. She would begin by validating their suffering. Everything they'd endured in previous trials, every betrayal they'd committed or witnessed, every moment when they'd chosen survival over principle. Liliya acknowledged all of it without judgment or dismissal. She confirmed that they were right to feel corrupted by their experiences, that their guilt was appropriate response to what they'd done and what had been done to them. Then she'd offer the path forward, purification through sacrifice, cutting away the parts of themselves that carried sin. The language was explicitly religious, framing self-mutilation as spiritual practice rather than psychiatric symptom. A finger that had pulled a trigger, an eye that had witnessed others suffering without intervening, a tongue that had spoken lies. Each body part could be identified with specific failures, and removing them became concrete demonstration of commitment to transformation. Modern reagents responded to this approach with the same vulnerability that previous generations had shown. Human psychology hasn't fundamentally changed in the decades Liliya spent unconscious. People still carry guilt about their compromises. They still seek meaning in suffering. They still want to believe their pain serves purposes beyond mere random cruelty. Liliya exploited these constants with methods refined through years of practice before her sedation. The pharmaceutical enhancements available in contemporary Outlast Trials made her more effective. Reagents entered the resort already chemically compromised in ways that increased suggestibility and reduced capacity for critical evaluation. The drugs didn't make them mindless, but they did make Liliya's voice feel more authoritative, her suggestions more compelling, her religious framework more plausible than it might have seemed to people with unaltered brain chemistry. Medical monitoring tracked reagents through the resort, measuring physiological responses while they interacted with Liliya, intervening when subjects reached dangerous thresholds. The technology allowed more precise calibration of how much damage each reagent could sustain before complete collapse. Some were physically resilient enough to survive multiple mutilations. Others required lighter prescriptions to avoid medical emergencies that would compromise data collection. Liliya adapted to these constraints with the same pragmatism she'd shown at Sinyala. If medical staff intervened to prevent a reagent from removing additional body parts, she'd frame the interruption as divine mercy, God showing them they'd sacrificed enough for now, allowing them to retain their remaining fingers as gifts rather than requirements. This flexibility made her more effective than prime assets, who became frustrated when unable to continue torture, because she could reframe any outcome as spiritually meaningful. The results were exceptional. Reagents emerged from the resort carrying both physical mutilations and profound psychological damage that made them extraordinarily compliant in subsequent conditioning. They'd proven to themselves that they could destroy their own bodies when authority told them it was necessary. They'd demonstrated that suffering could feel meaningful if properly framed. They'd learned that their judgment about what was real versus delusional couldn't be trusted, because they'd believed Liliya even while knowing intellectually that she might be manipulating them. This psychological profile made them ideal for whatever Murkoff's ultimate objectives were. The Outlast Trials was never just about breaking people for research purposes. It was about creating subjects so thoroughly reprogrammed that they could be deployed for purposes that remained classified, even within Murkoff's own documentation. People who'd mutilate themselves at divine command would follow other instructions regardless of how terrible those instructions might be. But the same problems that had plagued Sinyala began emerging. Staff members working with the resort started exhibiting concerning behavioral changes. Nothing dramatic initially, just increased interest in religious topics, comments about feeling spiritually empty, questions about whether their work at Murkoff served meaningful purposes. Administrators who'd experienced Sinyala's history recognized these as early-stage conversion symptoms and implemented stricter isolation protocols. Liliya was kept unconscious for longer periods, woken only for the minimum duration necessary to interact with reagents. Her time conscious was measured in hours rather than days, with sedation administered immediately after trial sessions ended. Staff rotation was increased, so nobody worked with the resort exclusively. Exposure time was tracked and limited through mandatory reassignment once individuals hit predetermined thresholds. These measures slowed conversion rates but couldn't eliminate them entirely. Some staff members were just vulnerable in ways that brief exposure could exploit. Others developed fascination with Liliya that overcame their professional detachment, requesting additional assignments to the resort despite knowing the psychological risks. A few disappeared from Murkoff's employment entirely, last seen alive but never successfully located afterwards, presumably having sought Liliya's guidance outside official programs. The pattern was unsustainable long-term for the same reasons it had been at Sinyala. Liliya was too effective to abandon, but too dangerous to deploy without creating institutional damage that eventually outweighed her value. At some point, Murkoff's leadership would face the same decision Vernica had confronted: keep her sedated permanently as expensive curiosity, or eliminate the problem she represented once and for all. That decision point hadn't arrived yet as of late 2025. The pharmacy remained operational within the Outlast Trials. Liliya remained at her post, dispensing rigs and judgment to reagents who had no idea of the history standing behind that counter. And somewhere in Murkoff's corporate hierarchy, people were calculating whether the exceptional results she produced justified the mounting costs and risks of containing her. What happens next depends on factors that remain classified or undecided, but the trajectory is clear. Liliya Bogomolova will eventually face a final resolution. She'll either be eliminated as too dangerous to maintain, or she'll break containment in ways that previous facilities prevented through sedation, or she'll continue existing in this liminal state indefinitely as institutional inertia prevents anyone from making hard decisions about her fate. The question Murkoff can't answer is whether eliminating her would actually end the threat she represents. If she's just a manipulative personality whose techniques depend on her physical presence, then killing her resolves the problem. But if she's something else, if her influence comes from genuine connection to forces beyond material reality, then her death might not prevent her voice from continuing to speak through people she's already converted, or from finding new vessels to carry forward the mission she believes God assigned her. Religious traditions would call those converted people her disciples. Psychiatric frameworks would call them victims of induced delusional disorder. The difference between those interpretations determines whether Liliya's legacy is spiritual corruption or psychological damage. Both produce the same observable outcomes: people who believe suffering is holy, who mutilate themselves as purification, who recognize her voice as carrying divine authority. And that's the final uncomfortable truth about Sister Liliya Bogomolova. Understanding everything about her history, her methods, her effects on victims, none of it resolves whether she's genuinely in contact with something transcendent or just extraordinarily skilled at exploiting wounded people's need for meaning. The ambiguity can't be eliminated through better documentation or more sophisticated analysis. You can describe what she does. You can catalog the damage she causes. You can implement protocols that limit her effectiveness and slow the spread of her influence. But you can't definitively answer whether the voice speaking through her comes from God or from the profound psychological damage of a child who spent her first decade in a homemade prison and interpreted her survival as divine calling. Maybe both things are true simultaneously. Maybe severe childhood trauma created the psychological structures that made her capable of hearing something most people can't perceive. Maybe divine forces work through broken people precisely because brokenness makes them permeable to communications that intact psychological defenses would block. Maybe the line between prophecy and madness doesn't exist because they're the same phenomenon interpreted from different perspectives. Or maybe she's just mentally ill and extraordinarily dangerous, and attributing spiritual meaning to her influence is exactly the kind of rationalization that lets her keep destroying people. Maybe the ambiguity she creates is itself a weapon. The uncertainty about whether to take her claims seriously makes resistance harder because you can never be completely sure you're not rejecting genuine divine truth. Murkoff's researchers never resolved this question. They treated her as an asset whose mechanisms remained partially mysterious, implementing practical containment measures without needing to understand whether she was psychologically explainable or spiritually authentic. From their perspective, the distinction didn't matter. What mattered was that she broke reagents more effectively than any other method they'd developed, and that keeping her sedated most of the time reduced dangers to acceptable levels. But for the people whose lives she touched, the wealthy industrialists who destroyed their fortunes at her request, the Mount Massive staff who removed their own fingers while praising God, Agent Nichols who arrived at the asylum missing limbs, the reagents who walked away from the pharmacy carrying strange new convictions, along with their supplies, the question of whether she was genuinely holy couldn't be dismissed as irrelevant philosophical speculation, because if she was just manipulative, they'd been tricked into destroying themselves. But if she actually heard God's voice, if the purification she prescribed was legitimate spiritual guidance, then they'd been given opportunities for redemption that they'd either accepted or rejected. Either way, the suffering was real. Either way, the damage was permanent. But the meaning of that suffering, whether it was cruel exploitation or divine testing, determined whether their lives had been destroyed or transformed. That's the horror Liliya represents. She forces the question of whether faith and manipulation can be distinguished, whether spiritual authority can exist independently of moral goodness, whether hearing God's voice makes someone holy, regardless of the terrible things they do with that divine communication. Most people prefer avoiding those questions by assuming faith and goodness must align, that genuine spiritual experience produces morally positive outcomes, that anyone who uses religious language to cause harm must be fraudulent. Liliya's existence challenges all those comfortable assumptions, and after encountering her, after hearing her voice and feeling its weight, after watching yourself or others do terrible things because she suggested they were holy, you can't return to simple certainties about the relationship between faith and madness, between divine calling and psychological delusion, between salvation and destruction. Epilogue: The Legacy of the Mantis. Sister Liliya Bogomolova remains active within the Outlast Trials. As of this recording, reagents continue approaching the pharmacy, meeting the woman who claims to speak God's words, walking away either broken beyond repair or broken in ways Murkoff finds useful. Her success rate exceeds historical averages. Her methods remain incompletely understood, and the question of whether she serves divine purposes or exemplifies the dangers of untreated severe mental illness remains unresolved. What's certain is that she survived everything that should have killed her. The homemade prison that should have left her unable to develop normal human consciousness, the siege of Leningrad that killed 1 million civilians, the mutilation and abuse during Nazi retreat, decades of chemical catatonia that should have destroyed her cognitive function. Each circumstance that should have been fatal somehow wasn't, and she interprets that survival as evidence of divine protection and mission. The people who've encountered her directly, those who survived the experience, describe effects that persist long after physical exposure ends. Her voice stays with you, they report. The things she said feel true even when you know intellectually they shouldn't. The possibility that she might actually hear something real haunts you during moments of doubt or spiritual crisis. You can't unhear what she told you about yourself, can't unsee the vision of purification she offered, can't completely dismiss the framework she provided for making sense of suffering. This lingering influence is what makes Liliya perhaps the most successful prime asset in Murkoff's history. The other prime assets, Coyle, Gooseberry, Barbie, inflict immediate trauma that damages reagents during exposure, but doesn't necessarily persist once victims leave their presence. You can escape Coyle's jurisdiction, avoid Gooseberry's orphanage, survive Barbie's evaluation. The trauma remains, but the source becomes memory rather than ongoing threat. Liliya's influence doesn't work that way. She plants something that grows in absence, that becomes more compelling rather than less as time passes. The doubt she introduces about whether your suffering serves divine purposes, about whether your guilt requires physical purification, about whether God actually speaks through broken prophets. These doubts flourish when you're alone with your thoughts in ways they might not during direct exposure, when rational defenses are more active. Religious traditions would call this spiritual warfare. The idea that demonic or corrupt spiritual forces can claim territory in human consciousness, establishing footholds that persist and expand unless actively resisted through spiritual practices. From that framework, Liliya's voice carries genuine spiritual authority that comes from dark sources, and the only protection is stronger connection to legitimate divine presence through prayer, sacraments, and religious community. Psychological frameworks would call it induced trauma response combined with exploited vulnerabilities around guilt and meaning making. Liliya identifies core psychological wounds and widens them, plants suggestions that resonate with existing pain, creates frameworks that make self-destruction feel meaningful. The persistence is ordinary post-traumatic symptomatology rather than spiritual infection, treatable through therapeutic intervention and cognitive restructuring. Both explanations fit the observable effects. People who've been exposed to Liliya struggle for years or lifetimes afterwards with questions about whether their suffering means something, whether physical pain could actually bring spiritual purification, whether the voice they heard might have been genuinely divine. Some eventually recover, integrating the experience as trauma they survived rather than truth they rejected. Others never fully escape her influence, carrying her suggestions like permanent psychic parasites that shape their self-understanding forever. The victims who died, the wealthy industrialists in post-war Europe, the Mount Massive staff, the Nazi officers she supposedly cursed, the reagents who didn't survive the resort, can't report their final thoughts about whether encountering her was damnation or salvation. Their silence leaves room for interpretations that confirm whichever framework you bring to the question. If you believe God works through broken prophets, they might have achieved redemption through their suffering. If you believe Liliya is mentally ill and manipulative, they were murdered through psychological exploitation. The evidence doesn't resolve which interpretation is correct because the victims are dead and can't testify about whether their deaths served sacred purposes or were just tragic endings to lives destroyed by encounter with a damaged predator. What remains is the legend, the feral girl who learned to speak through divine intervention, the angel of Leningrad who killed countless Germans through perfect patience and camouflage, the religious parasite who convinced wealthy industrialists to destroy themselves. The prime asset so dangerous she spent decades unconscious because no institution could contain her otherwise. The voice that planted seeds of doubt about whether suffering was meaningless or sacred, whether guilt required mutilation, whether God actually speaks through people who've survived impossible circumstances. Sister Liliya Bogomolova, beloved of God or embodiment of trauma, weaponized against the vulnerable, prophet or predator, divine instrument or psychiatric case study. Praying mantis hidden among corpses, waiting with impossible patience for prey to come close enough to strike. The woman whose tongue was cut out and who claims it grew back through miracle. The survivor who turned survival into mission and mission into justification for prescribing the suffering she endured. Her story forces questions about the nature of faith. the relationship between psychological damage and spiritual experience, the possibility of distinguishing genuine divine communication from pathological delusion. Those questions don't have comfortable answers. They resist resolution through better information or more sophisticated analysis. They remain open wounds in frameworks that prefer clear categories separating good from evil, sanity from madness, salvation from damnation. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the discomfort she creates, the uncertainty about how to interpret her existence, the ambiguity about whether she should be treated or followed, maybe that's exactly what Murkoff valued about her. An asset whose influence works partly through making people uncertain about their own judgment, who creates doubt about whether resistance serves self-preservation or spiritual cowardice, who weaponizes the universal human need for suffering to mean something. The lore of Liliya Bogomolova is ultimately the lore of how trauma, faith, survival, and manipulation interweave in ways that can't be cleanly separated. It's the story of how childhood horror can forge someone who inspires religious devotion while destroying everyone who follows her guidance. It's a chronicle of institutions trying to contain something that operates on levels their protocols can't address. It's a warning about the dangers of assuming prophets must be morally good, or that spiritual authority comes only from divine rather than demonic sources. And it's a question with no definitive answer. When you hear a voice claiming to speak God's words, how do you know whether to listen or run?